The wagon creaked over the muddy street as if it, too, was reluctant to arrive. Rain had fallen that morning, and now the dirt clung to the wheels in clots. A girl sat atop the buckboard, small, stiff, with her red braid tucked beneath a gray bonnet that had seen better years. Her eyes scanned the town like a prisoner seeing herself for the first time. No one waved. No one welcomed. She gripped the suitcase with both hands, though it was light. She had not packed it. It had been packed for her by a woman who kissed her on the cheek and whispered, "Maybe you'll be happier out there." The wagon driver, a thin man with tobacco-stained teeth, didn't offer words, only nodded toward the man waiting at the steps of the mercantile. Randall Pike. He was broader than the picture she'd been sent, older too. His beard had gone patchy, and a red welt bloomed under one eye. Drunk last night, maybe drunk still. He didn't smile, didn't step forward to help. Just looked her over like a horse too lean for the work he wanted. "Well," he muttered, "get down, then." She climbed down awkwardly. The suitcase thumped into the mud. When she bent to pick it up, her fingers slipped, and he sighed like she'd committed a sin. The townspeople watched. Edith Langley stood at the post office porch, arms crossed, face pursed like a lemon wedge. That the new bride? She asked no one in particular. Sheriff Harrow, seated in his usual rocker, lifted his hat in quiet acknowledgement but said nothing. The girl, Clara May Dalton, felt heat crawl up her neck. She hated that she still hoped someone might greet her kindly. That someone might say her name as if it mattered. But names didn't matter out here. Only roles. "Let's go," Randall barked, and she followed, suitcase in hand, shoes slick with mud. The house was 2 streets down, a lopsided cabin Randall had built himself, judging by the way the floor slanted and the nails sat like afterthoughts. Inside, it smelled of pipe smoke and burnt beans. A tin cup clattered on the table as he kicked a chair into place. "There's your room." He pointed down a hallway with no door. "We'll make it official next week, when Pastor's back. Don't expect fancy." She nodded. At the far end of the house, a stovepipe leaked soot down the wall. Clara placed her suitcase beside the cot and sat down. The mattress crunched beneath her, a bed of straw. Her fingers traced the small stitched initials on her lap, CMD. The only soft thing she owned. That night, Randall didn't speak during supper. She cooked what little there was: beans, boiled potatoes. He ate like a man punishing the food for being bland. Then he drank from a dark bottle until he slurred, and eventually he slept with his boots still on, mouth open. Outside, coyotes called across the prairie. Somewhere far off, thunder growled like a restless ghost. Clara sat by the window and pressed her hand to the glass. Her reflection stared back, pale and hollow-eyed. She whispered her name, just to remember it sounded like something human. The next morning, the sky was too wide. She walked beside Randall to the store, carrying his list. The townspeople looked, but none smiled. Edith Langley nodded once, but not out of kindness. As they left the store, a figure stood at the far end of the main street, silent, still. A man, tall and broad, his long black hair tied back, his chest wrapped in a deerskin vest. He leaned against a post like he'd been carved into it. He didn't speak. Didn't blink. Just watched. Clara's breath caught. Randall muttered, "Ignore him." She did. She tried. But something in the way the man looked, not at her but through the space around her, unsettled something long buried. That night, Randall drank again. He sat in the rocker and spat tobacco juice into a jar. When she asked if he'd like supper, he waved her off. Later, when she turned to go to bed, he grabbed her arm. "You're mine now, girl," he slurred. "Ain't that what you came here for?" She didn't answer. He didn't hit her. Not that night. The days blurred. Clara cleaned the house, did the laundry, fetched what Randall demanded. The town gave her names without ever learning her real one. The male bride. The Pike girl. That poor thing. One afternoon, by the well near the schoolhouse, she drew a bucket of water and turned to see the Comanche man again. He stood beneath the cottonwood, arms folded. Watching. Clara didn't move. He didn't either. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. He didn't speak. He simply reached into a pouch and laid something atop the stone rim of the well, a feather, bound in blue thread. Not a gift. Not a warning. Just a presence. Then he walked away. That evening, Clara placed the feather in a tin cup by the window. Randall never noticed. On Sundays, she sat in church beside a man who never prayed and listened to sermons about submission. The preacher's words curled in the air like nooses. She kept her head bowed, but her heart stood up straighter each week. Once, Sheriff Harrow passed her outside the church. His eyes lingered on a bruise beneath her sleeve. He didn't speak. Just tipped his hat and walked on. People knew. And silence was their answer. Clara began to speak less herself. But inside, something grew, not rebellion, not hope. Just a flicker of the girl she'd once been. The girl who wrote poems in a cotton field back in Virginia. The one who believed in fireflies and books and men who asked instead of taking. One morning, walking to the store alone, she saw the Comanche again. This time, he wasn't across the street. He was by the well. Waiting. She slowed. He held something in his hands, a folded blanket. Wool. Hand-woven. He offered it, arms extended. No smile. No request. Just the gesture. She took it. His eyes held no pity. Only recognition. The next morning, she wrapped herself in it before stepping into the cold. Randall didn't comment. But that night, when he came home drunk, he pulled it from her shoulders and threw it in the fire. He laughed. Clara watched it burn. She didn't cry. Outside, snow had begun to fall. Quiet, delicate flakes drifting down like forgotten prayers. In the dark, she whispered her name again. This time, it sounded stronger. And far off, beyond the town, past the trees, a man who didn't ask for names built a fire of his own and waited for the next morning to rise. The bruise bloomed just above the collarbone, dull and plum-colored like a rotting apple. Clara buttoned her dress higher than usual, but the fabric couldn't quite hide it. Nor did it matter. Everyone in town saw. They just pretended not to. The general store was warm and thick with dust that glimmered in the sunlight. Clara stood near the counter, counting coins with fingers that shook slightly. Randall had sent her to fetch lamp oil and chewing tobacco. He hadn't liked supper last night. He said the beans tasted like ash. He'd thrown the tin plate at the wall. Then he'd reached for her arm and gripped it until something inside her felt small and breakable. She slid the coins across the counter. The shopkeeper didn't look her in the eye. From the back room, Edith Langley's voice carried, "I told you, Randall Pike don't need a wife. He needs a mule." A pause, then quieter, "and I doubt she's strong enough for even that." Clara's ears burned. She collected her parcels and turned to leave just as a chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. A figure stood near the door, leaning against a wooden beam like it had always belonged there. Toma Blackbird. He didn't move. Didn't speak. But his eyes, deep and steady, rested on her. Not in pity. Not even in sympathy. Just presence. Clara froze. The air in the room tightened. Edith Langley stepped forward, noticed Toma, and let out a soft, indignant scoff. "He's always lurking lately." Toma didn't react. Clara lowered her head and walked past him, but not before a single moment passed between them, a breath, a blink. Enough for her to feel the strange safety of being seen. Outside, the sky was winter bright. The light on the snow made everything too sharp. Her boots slipped in the ice, but she didn't fall. She never did. Not where people could see. Randall was waiting at the house, already drunk. He was always drunk lately. The kind of mean that didn't need a reason. When she handed him the tobacco, he grunted something that sounded like thanks but didn't reach his eyes. Later, when she forgot to bring the oil lamp into the sitting room before dusk, he backhanded her. Not hard. just enough to remind her. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She only stood there, her hand to her cheek, and felt something quiet inside her beginning to shift. Not anger. Not yet. Just a slow, steady unraveling of belief. That this was normal. That this was the price of being chosen. The next morning, the bruise on her face had spread like ink under water. Still, she walked to town. Still, she held her head level. Sheriff Harrow saw her at the well, drawing water. His eyes lingered again. Then, as always, he tipped his hat and said nothing. Cowards, all of them. She passed the schoolhouse on her way home. Children played in the yard, bundled in wool scarves and laughing like the world had never been cruel. Clara stopped and watched them a moment, arms wrapped around herself. A little girl, dark-haired, gap-toothed, ran up and offered her a red string she said was a magic ribbon. Clara smiled. The girl grinned back, then ran off, her laughter trailing behind her like a kite tail. Clara tied the ribbon around her wrist and kept walking. That evening, she found something on her porch. A blanket. Hand-woven again, but not the same as before. This one was thicker, with darker threads and small beads stitched into the corner. She didn't need to ask where it came from. She stood there a long time, holding it to her chest, snow falling lightly into her hair. Randall noticed it when he came home but said nothing. Maybe he assumed someone in town had taken pity. Maybe he just didn't care anymore. That night, Clara slept wrapped in the blanket and dreamed of a river that ran without end, and a hawk circling overhead. In the weeks that followed, she noticed Toma more often. He was never close. Never too near. But always within sight. By the well. Near the river. Leaning on the church fence. He never spoke. Not once. But his silence began to feel like something she could lean into. One afternoon, Randall tripped and fell on his way back from the saloon. Clara reached to help him, and he shoved her hard enough to send her into the snow. Her wrist struck the edge of the trough. She didn't make a sound. Didn't even curse. But later, as she soaked her swollen hand in cold water, she thought of the bird carved into her memory, the one Toma had given her without touch or name. It had felt like hope. One day, she saw Edith Langley by the church again. "You look tired," the older woman said, all fake sweetness. "I suppose that's the price of being a wife." Clara looked up and said softly, "No, ma'am. That's the price of being bought." Edith stared at her, stunned. Clara walked away. Later that evening, she found a pair of moccasins outside the back door. Not new, but lovingly stitched. Her shoes had holes. She'd wrapped them with twine. She didn't cry, not even then. But she placed them carefully beside her bed, like they were sacred. Randall didn't notice them. Or if he did, he didn't say a word. He noticed less and less, except when he drank. Then he noticed everything. One night, he accused her of staring at other men. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he growled, breath sour and words slurred. "You think I don't see it in your eyes." She stood still, the fire crackling behind her. "I see you looking. You think he'd want you? You're ruined." He raised his hand. She didn't flinch. He dropped it. Turned away. That night, Clara sat on the porch after he slept. The stars were sharp and bright. The kind of night that made the prairie feel endless. Toma stepped out of the shadows. Not too near. Not threatening. He stood at the edge of the yard, the moon silvering his shoulders, the snow around him untouched. He raised one hand, not a wave, not a beckoning, just a gesture of acknowledgement. Clara lifted her own, slowly. It was the first time she'd done that. Inside, Randall stirred. The door creaked. Toma was gone before it opened. But something had happened. Something real and quiet and strong. Not a rescue. Not a romance. A recognition. And that, more than anything, was what she'd been starving for. She wrapped herself in the Comanche's blanket and whispered into the night. "I see you, too." And across the prairie, in a cabin of cedar and ash, a man who had once lost everything stood at his own window and whispered nothing at all. The morning began like any other, with frost on the window panes and silence between them. Randall sat at the table nursing a headache with bad coffee, his breath thick with last night's whiskey. Clara moved quietly, setting a plate of dry cornbread in front of him. Her wrist still ached from where he'd grabbed it 2 days ago. He looked at the bread, then at her. "That all?" She nodded. He shoved the plate away, the tin scraping loud across the wood. "What good is a wife who can't even cook?" Clara didn't answer. She'd learned the danger in meeting anger with words. But inside, something brittle cracked. Not enough to break, but enough to ache. They walked to town later, Randall insisting she come along. He said he needed to show folks things were fine. He hadn't said what that meant. She followed with her head bowed, coat patched at the elbows, red ribbon still tied at her wrist. The streets were slushed with melting snow, brown and gray. The church bell hadn't yet rung, but folk were gathering near the mercantile. Sunday was for gossip as much as for God. Edith Langley stood by the tailor shop, arms folded, whispering behind a gloved hand to a friend. Sheriff Harrow leaned against the railing outside the jail, chewing a toothpick and pretending not to notice anything. Clara kept her eyes down. Randall stopped outside the saloon, talking loud with a group of men. "She's too high for herself, this one. Thinks silence is strength. Thinks quiet means pride." He turned to her, eyes wild. "Did you hear me?" She paused. "Yes." "Then answer me when I speak." He stepped forward and slapped her. The sound cracked like gunfire against the cold air. People froze. She staggered back, her hand to her face. A red bloom already rising on her cheek. No one moved. Not the shopkeeper, not Edith, not the sheriff. Even the breeze seemed to stop. And then, from across the street, a shadow stepped forward. Toma Blackbird. He walked with purpose, slow and silent, like a storm that didn't need thunder to be feared. The crowd parted before him without being asked. He stopped beside Randall, close enough that their boots nearly touched. Randall puffed up. "What do you want, savage?" Toma said nothing. His eyes fell on Clara, steady, grounding, familiar. Then he turned back to Randall and reached up slowly, deliberately, and wrapped his hand around the man's raised wrist. Randall jerked, but he couldn't move. Toma's grip didn't tighten. It didn't need to. Sheriff Harrow stepped off the porch, hand near his revolver but not drawing it. "Toma." Still, no words from the warrior. Clara's breath caught. Not because she feared a fight, but because for the first time, someone had stepped forward. Not to rescue her, not to scold her pain, but to interrupt the ritual. Randall yanked his arm back. "Keep your hands off what's mine." Toma stepped closer, eyes sharp as arrowheads. "She is not yours," he said, voice quiet, low, final. The silence after was deafening. Randall laughed once, a brittle, pathetic sound, then looked around, hoping for support. No one offered it. Not Edith. Not the men near the saloon. Not even the sheriff. The townsfolk looked at the mud. At their boots. Anywhere but at the truth unfolding. Toma turned and walked away. No threats. No fanfare. Just the act itself, clean, simple, unflinching. Clara stood still. Her cheek burned, but something else swelled larger beneath it, something older than fear. A memory of worth. Randall growled, but didn't chase her. He stomped back into the saloon like a dog slinking into darkness. Clara didn't follow. Instead, she walked. No destination. Just away. People parted for her too now, uncertain. Uneasy. Not pitying her. Not mocking. Just watching. She walked until she reached the edge of town, where the woods thickened and the trail curved toward the river. The air was clearer here. The silence deeper. Birds darted between bare branches. The world felt raw, waiting. She reached the water's edge and knelt. Snow still ringed the banks, but the river kept moving. She dipped her fingers in. It stung. It grounded. And then, a sound behind her. Soft. She turned. Toma stood several paces away, his presence like the trees, quiet, strong, unbending. He held out something. A pouch. Leather. Tied with rawhide. She rose slowly and accepted it. Inside, a balm made from crushed pine needles and bear fat. She didn't ask how he knew. He didn't ask what happened. Their silence spoke. She looked at him then, not as a stranger, not as a protector, but as a man. Flesh and soul. Wounded in ways different from her own, yet somehow stitched by the same thread of endurance. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Toma tilted his head, as if hearing something she could not. You don't need to, he replied. She pressed the pouch to her chest. Snow began to fall again, soft as breath. When she turned to leave, he didn't follow. But she felt him there, like firelight in winter. And something in her spine stood taller. By the time she reached home, Randall was gone. The saloon doors had swallowed him whole. She boiled water. Dabbed the balm onto her swollen cheek. The sting eased. Not just on her skin, but somewhere deeper. Later, she lit the small oil lamp and sat at the window. She untied the red ribbon from her wrist and placed it beside the bird carving Toma had given her long ago. Her little altar of mercy. Outside, the sky stretched wide and gray. And far off, across the trees, a man returned to his own cabin. Alone. But not unseen. Not anymore. The bruises faded, but something stronger remained. It was in the way Clara walked now, not fast, not hiding, but steady, like each footstep pressed a new law into the earth. The townsfolk noticed. They didn't say it outright, but they watched longer. Whispered sooner. She no longer buttoned her dress to her throat. The purple shadow on her neck had vanished, and with it, her need to shrink. Her hair, once hidden tight beneath a bonnet, now fell in a loose braid down her back, wind stirring the red strands like a banner. She moved through the street with quiet dignity, her eyes no longer scanning the dirt, but the horizon. Miss Langley saw it first. She's got airs now, she murmured from the porch of the post office. Strutting about like she owns the town. But even she said it softer than usual. Clara passed her without looking. Randall hadn't returned home that week. He'd taken to sleeping in the back of the saloon or not at all. Once, Clara saw him from a distance, sitting in the alley beside the stables, head in his hands. She felt no victory. Only distance. Like he'd become a figure from an old chapter she no longer had to reread. Each morning, Clara walked to the river with a pail. Not out of need, but for the ritual. The cold water steadied her. She'd sit sometimes, just past the birch trees, and breathe into the silence. That's where she saw him again. Toma. He didn't approach. But his presence became a rhythm, appearing like smoke on the wind, gone before she could thank him for the balm, the blanket, the bird. She didn't need to speak. The silence between them had become its own language. What he gave her was not possession. It was permission to be, to grow, to begin again. At her porch one morning, she found a small wooden carving, a wren, wings open mid-flight, balanced on a branch. The details were impossibly fine. Even the eyes carried sorrow and motion. She placed it on her windowsill. The town noticed. Some muttered that she was seeing that Comanche. Others scoffed and said she was dreaming above her station. One woman called her reckless. Another called her ruined. But the baker's wife offered her a smile one morning, and the blacksmith's boy tipped his hat when she passed. And Sheriff Harrow, he began nodding a little slower, like maybe now he understood what he'd failed to do. That Sunday, Clara walked into church alone. Her shawl was soft and clean, her hands folded like wings. When the preacher spoke of mercy, she looked him full in the face. When he spoke of duty, she looked at the floor. At the end of the service, as people filed past the pews, she remained seated. Edith Langley passed by, paused, then said, "You know, people are talking." Clara turned to her. Her voice was calm. "Let them talk." Outside, the wind caught her skirt and lifted the hem just slightly. She let it. She stood taller in the cold. That week, she visited the tailor. The woman there, a widow with strong shoulders and sharp eyes, let Clara choose from a bin of scrap fabric. Clara picked calico in faded reds and dusty blues, sewing in the evenings by lamplight. Her fingers ached, but her stitches held. She made herself a new dress. Simple. Honest. Hers. She wore it into town 3 days later. Randall was on the porch of the saloon, watching her. He called her name, not cruel, not loud. Just a name. She paused. He stood, slow. He looked like a man who didn't know what to say to the thing he'd once owned but now couldn't reach. He began. Clara shook her head gently. No. She didn't say more. She walked away. It was the first time she'd left him standing in his silence. Later, that same day, she found a bundle on her porch. Wrapped in rough cloth, tied with a strip of deerskin. Inside, a pair of moccasins, hand-stitched, the soles soft with pine ash. Her old shoes were worn to the thread. She'd never once complained aloud. She put them on. She wore them to the market the next morning. Randall saw. So did the town. No one spoke. But the silence had changed shape. They weren't ignoring her anymore. They were unsure of her. And perhaps of themselves. That afternoon, she walked past the schoolhouse where children played in melting snow. One little girl waved. Another called out, "Miss Clara." Clara smiled, and something inside her unodded. It was strange to be noticed for something other than pain. Stranger still to feel that it might be allowed. Toma came to her that evening. Not close. Just past the fence, where the yard met the open field. He waited there, arms at his side, as if respecting a line not yet crossed. Clara stepped onto the porch. The wind lifted her braid like a ribbon. The wren sat on the sill beside her. "You carved it," she said, more to the wind than to him. He nodded. She stepped down the stairs. Walked toward the fence. Not all the way. Just enough that her voice wouldn't need to rise. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said. Toma met her eyes. "I know." She paused. "You've given me more than kindness." "I've given nothing," he replied. "I only saw what was already there." And in that stillness, the dusk folding between them like a blanket, she felt something new rise in her, not gratitude, not need. Respect. Mutual. Quiet. Earned. She turned back toward the house. Her footsteps light in the snow. He remained by the fence. Not waiting. Just willing. That night, she sat at her window and sewed by lamplight. Her fingers moved slow, thoughtful. The bird watched her from its perch. Her new dress hung neatly nearby, and the moccasins sat drying near the hearth. Outside, a storm was building in the hills. Inside, Clara smiled. Because whatever came next, she would no longer meet it bowed. It was a gray morning, brittle with wind and the taste of snow still hidden in the clouds. Clara stood on her porch, fingers wrapped around a steaming tin cup, watching the quiet settle over the town like breath on glass. The wren carving caught the early light, its wings open mid-flight, as if ready to leave with her. She had packed a small sack, just flour, matches, thread, the calico dress she'd sewn herself. She had no real plan, only a direction, away. Not toward Toma, not toward anyone. Just away from the weight of waiting. Waiting for Randall to strike, for the town to change, for someone to name what had always been wrong. Her boots crunched softly over frozen ground as she crossed the yard. She didn't look back. She hadn't seen Randall in 2 days. That absence used to fill her with relief. Now it filled her with a tension she couldn't shake. There was something about quiet men and cruel men, one watched with intent, the other with hunger. She could no longer afford to confuse the two. At the edge of town, she passed Sheriff Harrow. He was leaning on the hitching post outside the jail, chewing something slow. "You headed somewhere, Miss Clara?" he asked, voice dry. "Somewhere softer," she said. He squinted at the sky, then at her bag. "That place doesn't exist out here." "Then I'll make it." He didn't stop her. Just tipped his hat and looked away. As she turned the bend past the livery stable, the saloon doors burst open with a sound like a snapped tree limb. Randall Pike stumbled out, eyes red, shirt half untucked, a bottle in one hand and rage in the other. "There she is," he shouted. Clara froze. The townsfolk, as always, watched. Randall stormed toward her, his boots dragging in the slush. "You think you're something now, huh? With your moccasins and your stray dog of a man watching you from the trees?" She didn't speak. She didn't move. He grabbed her arm. "You listen to me," he hissed, breath sour. "You don't leave. You don't shame me like this." She looked up at him, eyes steady, unflinching. "Let go. I'll teach you what letting go means." The sound came before the movement. A bootfall behind them, slow, deliberate. Randall stiffened. Toma stood a dozen paces away, at the edge of the street. He wore a worn wool shirt, dark trousers, his black hair loose in the wind. No weapon. No war cry. Just presence. The crowd stilled. Randall barked a bitter laugh. "Here he comes." The mute mutt. He tightened his grip on Clara. "This your man now? You think he's better than me?" Toma took one step forward. Randall shoved Clara. She stumbled, nearly fell. That was enough. In 3 strides, Toma closed the distance. He didn't shout. Didn't warn. He simply moved faster than breath, surer than any threat Randall had ever known. His hand clamped Randall's wrist, twisting until the bottle dropped into the slush with a dull thud. Randall howled, tried to swing, but Toma ducked it easily. The second hand came up, not as a fist, but flat, striking Randall across the chest hard enough to knock the wind out of him. Randall fell backward into the mud, gasping. The street was silent. Even the wind paused. Toma turned to Clara. His eyes searched hers, not for permission, not for thanks, but for confirmation that she was still choosing herself. She was. Behind her, someone cleared their throat. Sheriff Harrow stepped forward slowly. "You want me to arrest him, Clara?" She looked at Randall, broken, wet, sputtering in the dirt. The man who once bought her like flour. The man who never once asked who she was before trying to make her small. "No," she said. "There's no use in caging a man who already lives inside one." The sheriff looked at her with something like respect. "Then he'll be gone by nightfall." Toma hadn't moved. Neither had she. They stood in the middle of a street that had once been her shame. Now it was only a place. She turned to him. "You didn't ask for me." "I never would," he said softly. Her voice caught, fragile as thawing ice. "Then what would you do?" "I would build you a room with 2 doors," he said. "So you'd never forget you could leave." The town didn't cheer. No one clapped. But something broke in the air, subtle and sure, like the moment between lightning and thunder. Clara took a step toward him. Not because she was claimed. Because she chose. They walked side by side through the square, past eyes that now looked with something more complex than gossip. She didn't care what they called it, pity, scandal, courage. She had walked through fire and not been claimed by it. The sun broke through the clouds as they reached the hill beyond the mill. At the top stood Toma's cabin, low and quiet, made of cedar and stone. A wisp of smoke trailed from the chimney. A hawk circled overhead. Inside, it was warm. Simple. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Just breathing. The scent of sage. The hush of stillness. The hum of her own ribs finally loosening. Toma moved to stoke the fire. Clara stepped to the window, pulled the shawl tight around her shoulders, and watched as snow began to fall in slow, drifting spirals. He didn't speak. He didn't ask her to stay. But he placed his second chair beside the hearth. And she sat in it. Outside, the wind carried away the names she'd been given. Mail order bride. Worn girl. Pike's property. Inside, a new name rose quietly in her chest. Not his. Not someone's. Just Clara. Whole. And when she finally spoke, it was not to him, but to the silence she had once feared. Some men take your voice. Some never ask for it. And some give you back the sound of your own. Toma looked up. And smiled.